The crisp morning air carried the faint hum of office chatter and the distant scent of freshly brewed coffee. Inside the sprawling headquarters of Horizon Dynamics, an empire built on cutting-edge technology and precision manufacturing, the staff hurried through their routines. It was a typical day, or so it seemed. A new janitor, wearing a faded uniform and carrying a mop bucket, quietly entered the employee lounge. His name tag read Carl, but the man behind the disguise was far from ordinary. This unassuming figure was actually Richard Ellis, the founder and CEO of Horizon Dynamics. Richard, a self-made billionaire, was known for his business acumen, relentless work ethic, and ability to turn small ventures into global enterprises. But lately, he had grown uneasy. Despite his company's soaring profits, rumors of toxic behavior among his staff had reached his ears. Complaints whispered anonymously suggested favoritism, bullying, and a lack of empathy. Something was wrong, and Richard knew he had to uncover the truth. He couldn't trust traditional methods like anonymous surveys or HR reports. Those could be manipulated. Instead, he decided to take an unconventional route. Inspired by an old story he'd heard about an undercover boss, Richard devised a plan to step into the shoes of the invisible workforce, the janitorial staff. He would observe his employees' behavior without the filter of his title and wealth. He wanted to know who they truly were when they thought no one was watching. The transformation had been both humbling and enlightening. Gone were his tailored suits and polished leather shoes. Instead, he donned a cheap uniform, scuffed work boots, and a worn baseball cap. His silver Rolex was locked away, replaced by a $20 plastic watch. To complete the disguise, he let his beard grow scruffy and smeared dirt onto his hands for an authentic touch. Even his voice changed. A slight rasp added to mask his commanding tone. Richard's first day as Carl was uneventful but eye-opening. Most employees barely glanced at him as he cleaned the floors and emptied trash bins. It was as though he were a piece of the furniture, blending into the background. The receptionist, a young woman named Megan, gave him a polite smile, but the interaction was fleeting. Others walked by him without acknowledgement. Yet it was the behavior of his senior manager, Paul, that caught Richard's attention. Paul was efficient but curt, his words sharp as a blade. Richard noticed how Paul dismissed Megan's questions with a wave of his hand and barked orders at a junior team member who looked on the verge of tears. During a coffee break, Richard overheard Paul mocking an employee who had taken time off for a family emergency, calling them soft and uncommitted. The arrogance in Paul's tone churned Richard's stomach. Was this the kind of culture he had unknowingly allowed to fester? Despite these moments of discomfort, Richard also witnessed acts of quiet kindness. Sarah, an accountant juggling work and raising 2 young kids alone, stayed late one evening to help a junior colleague balance a spreadsheet. "Don't worry," she had said with a tired but genuine smile. "We've all been there." And then there was Megan, who discreetly placed a box of granola bars in the break room with a note that read, "Take one if you're hungry. No judgment." Richard smiled to himself, wondering how someone with so little authority could radiate so much compassion. The pivotal moment of his first week came on a rainy Thursday. Richard had just finished mopping the cafeteria floor when he noticed a young intern, Alex, struggling to carry a stack of files. The intern tripped, scattering papers everywhere. As Alex scrambled to pick them up, Paul walked by. Instead of helping, Paul smirked. "Better learn how to walk if you want to survive here," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. Before Richard could intervene, Megan rushed over, kneeling to help Alex gather the papers. "Don't listen to him," she whispered, her voice steady. "You're doing great." Richard felt a pang of both pride and shame. Pride for employees like Megan and Sarah, but shame that people like Paul were allowed to represent his company's leadership. By the end of the week, Richard's initial observations were both troubling and inspiring. The office was a microcosm of human behavior, selflessness and greed, empathy and apathy, all coexisting under one roof. He realized that his experiment was far more than a fact-finding mission. It was a test of his company's soul. But the most shocking moment came when Richard stumbled upon a hidden truth about Paul. Late one evening, as Richard emptied trash bins in the executive wing, he found a torn piece of paper in Paul's office. It was a termination notice for Sarah. The reason? Low productivity during Q3. Richard's blood boiled. He knew Sarah's performance had been impacted by her personal struggles. Her young son had been hospitalized earlier that year. Yet, her kindness and dedication to her team had never wavered. Clutching the paper, Richard made a silent vow. Things were going to change. But first, he needed to dig deeper. The next phase of his experiment would involve direct interactions, subtle provocations, and perhaps even a confrontation with Paul. Richard didn't know where this journey would lead, but he was certain of one thing. Horizon Dynamics was about to be transformed forever. Richard's decision to disguise himself as a janitor wasn't made lightly. It had taken weeks of meticulous planning to prepare for his transformation. He had hired a professional makeup artist to subtly alter his features, practiced slouching to change his posture, and even worked with an acting coach to perfect a softer, less commanding voice. To avoid suspicion, Richard arranged for Carl to be hired through a third-party cleaning agency, bypassing any connection to Horizon Dynamics' HR department. Now, as he pushed a mop bucket down the gleaming hallways of his own company, he realized just how much he had underestimated the life of a janitor. The first challenge was physical. Hours of scrubbing, lifting, and hauling trash bins left his back aching and his hands blistered. By the end of his first day, Richard collapsed onto the lumpy mattress of a modest motel room he had rented to complete the illusion. Despite his exhaustion, he couldn't sleep. The snippets of conversation he had overheard throughout the day replayed in his mind. Most were mundane, complaints about deadlines, gossip about weekend plans, but others hinted at deeper issues. On his second day, Richard began to observe patterns in behavior. Some employees, like Megan the receptionist, treated him with respect and kindness, offering a smile or a quick thank you. Others acted as though he didn't exist, walking past him without so much as a glance. Then there were those, like Paul, who seemed to relish their power, even in small, petty ways. Paul's voice was often the loudest in the room, not because he had something valuable to say, but because he enjoyed asserting dominance. It wasn't just his words that grated on Richard. It was the way Paul looked at people, as though they were tools to be used and discarded. The office cafeteria became a key observation point. Employees gathered there for coffee breaks and casual conversations, revealing more about themselves than they likely realized. Richard noticed Sarah, the overworked accountant, sitting alone with her lunch most days. She seemed exhausted but determined, her eyes focused on spreadsheets even as she ate. Once, Richard saw her offer her seat to an intern when the cafeteria grew crowded, standing awkwardly by the wall with her lunch tray balanced precariously in one hand. It was a small gesture, but it stuck with him. Then there was Megan, whose desk was a flurry of sticky notes and potted plants. Richard couldn't help but admire her cheerful resilience. Despite being treated dismissively by higher-ups like Paul, Megan went out of her way to make others feel welcome. She greeted every visitor with a warm smile, helped new employees navigate the labyrinth of paperwork, and even kept a stash of snacks in her drawer for anyone who might need them. Richard began to see her as the heart of the office, a quiet force of positivity in an environment that could often feel cold and impersonal. By the end of his second week, Richard felt he had a decent understanding of the office dynamics, but he still had questions. Why was Paul so aggressive? What drove Sarah to keep going despite her obvious struggles? And how did employees truly feel about working at Horizon Dynamics? He decided to take a more active approach, engaging in subtle conversations and small acts of kindness to test their reactions. One evening, as he was cleaning the break room, Richard overheard a heated argument coming from the conference room. It was a termination notice for Sarah. The reason? Low productivity during Q3. Richard's blood boiled. He knew Sarah's performance had been impacted by her personal struggles. Her young son had been hospitalized earlier that year. Yet, her kindness and dedication to her team had never wavered. Clutching the paper, Richard made a silent vow. Things were going to change. But first, he needed to dig deeper. The next phase of his experiment would involve direct interactions, subtle provocations, and perhaps even a confrontation with Paul. Richard didn't know where this journey would lead, but he was certain of one thing. Horizon Dynamics was about to be transformed forever. Richard's decision to disguise himself as a janitor wasn't made lightly. It had taken weeks of meticulous planning to prepare for his transformation. He had hired a professional makeup artist to subtly alter his features, practiced slouching to change his posture, and even worked with an acting coach to perfect a softer, less commanding voice. To avoid suspicion, Richard arranged for Carl to be hired through a third-party cleaning agency, bypassing any connection to Horizon Dynamics' HR department. Now, as he pushed a mop bucket down the gleaming hallways of his own company, he realized just how much he had underestimated the life of a janitor. The first challenge was physical. Hours of scrubbing, lifting, and hauling trash bins left his back aching and his hands blistered. By the end of his first day, Richard collapsed onto the lumpy mattress of a modest motel room he had rented to complete the illusion. Despite his exhaustion, he couldn't sleep. The snippets of conversation he had overheard throughout the day replayed in his mind. Most were mundane, complaints about deadlines, gossip about weekend plans, but others hinted at deeper issues. On his second day, Richard began to observe patterns in behavior. Some employees, like Megan the receptionist, treated him with respect and kindness, offering a smile or a quick thank you. Others acted as though he didn't exist, walking past him without so much as a glance. Then there were those, like Paul, who seemed to relish their power, even in small, petty ways. Paul's voice was often the loudest in the room, not because he had something valuable to say, but because he enjoyed asserting dominance. It wasn't just his words that grated on Richard. It was the way Paul looked at people, as though they were tools to be used and discarded. The office cafeteria became a key observation point. Employees gathered there for coffee breaks and casual conversations, revealing more about themselves than they likely realized. Richard noticed Sarah, the overworked accountant, sitting alone with her lunch most days. She seemed exhausted but determined, her eyes focused on spreadsheets even as she ate. Once, Richard saw her offer her seat to an intern when the cafeteria grew crowded, standing awkwardly by the wall with her lunch tray balanced precariously in one hand. It was a small gesture, but it stuck with him. Then there was Megan, whose desk was a flurry of sticky notes and potted plants. Richard couldn't help but admire her cheerful resilience. Despite being treated dismissively by higher-ups like Paul, Megan went out of her way to make others feel welcome. She greeted every visitor with a warm smile, helped new employees navigate the labyrinth of paperwork, and even kept a stash of snacks in her drawer for anyone who might need them. Richard began to see her as the heart of the office, a quiet force of positivity in an environment that could often feel cold and impersonal. By the end of his second week, Richard felt he had a decent understanding of the office dynamics, but he still had questions. Why was Paul so aggressive? What drove Sarah to keep going despite her obvious struggles? And how did employees truly feel about working at Horizon Dynamics? He decided to take a more active approach, engaging in subtle conversations and small acts of kindness to test their reactions. One evening, as he was cleaning the break room, Richard overheard a heated argument coming from the conference room. The following Monday morning, the office hummed with its usual rhythm, but Richard felt an unusual tension in the air. His mind was consumed with how to proceed. He had spent the weekend poring over the documents he had uncovered in Paul's office, considering every angle of the situation. Confronting Paul outright could risk exposing his cover too early, but doing nothing would make him complicit in the toxic culture he had inadvertently allowed to flourish. He resolved to take more calculated steps to test not only Paul but the other employees whose behavior had caught his attention. Richard's first move was to shift his focus toward fostering deeper connections with employees like Megan and Sarah. If he could understand their motivations and struggles on a more personal level, he might be able to pinpoint the underlying issues within the company. He started with Megan, the receptionist who had stood out for her warmth and quiet acts of kindness. One afternoon, as he was wiping down a table in the break room, Richard struck up a casual conversation. "You're always helping people out around here," he said, gesturing toward a granola bar she had just left on the counter with one of her cheerful notes. "Doesn't that get tiring?" Megan laughed, brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "It does sometimes," she admitted. "But if I don't do it, who will? This place can be a lot." Richard raised an eyebrow. "A lot?" Megan hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "Let's just say not everyone here has your back. Some people only look out for themselves, and if you're not careful, you'll get trampled." The bitterness in her tone surprised Richard. Megan's sunny demeanor had always seemed unshakable, but now he saw cracks in the facade. "Has that happened to you?" he asked gently. Megan shrugged, avoiding his gaze. "It's part of the job. You learn to deal with it." Richard filed this away, resolving to dig deeper into what Megan had endured. For now, he shifted his focus to Sarah. Her struggles were more apparent, but Richard wanted to understand why someone so obviously dedicated was considered non-essential in Paul's eyes. That evening, he found Sarah working late again, her desk piled high with paperwork. "You're here late," he said, leaning on his mop handle. Sarah looked up, startled, then smiled wearily. "Story of my life. Deadlines don't wait." Richard gestured toward the papers. "Looks like a lot for one person. Do you ever get help?" Sarah shook her head. "Not really. Everyone's stretched thin, and I don't want to be the one who can't pull her weight." He hesitated before asking, "Do you ever think about asking for a lighter load? Sounds like you've got enough on your plate already." Her expression hardened, and she let out a bitter laugh. "And let them think I'm weak. No thanks. I can't afford to give Paul or anyone else more reasons to get rid of me." Her words stung. Sarah's fear was palpable, and it angered Richard that anyone in his company felt so disposable. As he continued his rounds that night, he resolved to confront Paul indirectly, testing his leadership without revealing his true identity. The next morning, Richard arrived early to clean Paul's office. While he worked, Paul entered, his phone pressed to his ear. Richard kept his head down, pretending not to listen, but Paul's sharp tone made it impossible to ignore. "I don't care if she's got a kid in the hospital," Paul snapped. "This is a business, not a charity. If she can't deliver, she's out." Richard's blood boiled, but he forced himself to stay calm. When Paul ended the call, Richard deliberately knocked over a stack of papers, sending them scattering across the floor. "Sorry about that," Richard muttered, bending down to pick them up. Paul sighed irritably. "Be more careful next time." As Richard gathered the papers, he made a show of examining one of them, a performance review. "Looks like a tough job, managing all these people," he said casually. "Must be hard to keep everyone in line." Paul smirked. "It's not hard if you know how to handle them. People need to be reminded who's in charge, or they'll walk all over you." Richard stood, clutching the papers. "And what happens if they're going through something tough? Do you give them a break, or—" Paul cut him off with a dismissive wave. "This isn't kindergarten. If they can't handle the pressure, they're in the wrong place." Richard nodded, biting back his anger. This was exactly the kind of mentality he needed to root out, but he couldn't tip his hand just yet. Instead, he decided to take a more proactive approach, staging scenarios to test the true character of his employees. The first test came later that week. Richard arranged for a delivery driver, actually an actor he had hired, to show up with a cart full of heavy boxes. The actor feigned struggling as he tried to push the cart through the front doors. Richard, still in his janitor guise, stood nearby, pretending to mop the floor. To his surprise, Megan was the first to rush over. "Do you need a hand?" she asked, already grabbing one of the boxes. She called for Ethan, the intern, who hesitated for a moment before joining her. Together, they helped the delivery driver unload the boxes, chatting and laughing as they worked. Paul, on the other hand, walked right past without so much as a glance. The second test involved Sarah. Richard intentionally spilled a small bag of trash near her desk, then waited to see how she would react. To his surprise, Sarah immediately grabbed a tissue and began cleaning up the mess. "Don't worry about it," she said when he apologized. "I've got kids at home. This is nothing." The final test came on Friday, during the weekly team meeting. Richard planted himself in the back of the room, quietly observing as Paul led the discussion. The atmosphere was tense, with Paul firing off questions and criticizing anyone who hesitated to answer. When the meeting ended, Richard watched as employees filed out, their heads down and shoulders slumped. It was clear to Richard that the company's culture was broken, but he also saw glimmers of hope in people like Megan, Sarah, and Ethan. They were the heart of Horizon Dynamics, and he was determined to protect them. That evening, as he mopped the empty hallways, Richard felt a renewed sense of purpose. The time for observation was over. It was time to act. He would confront Paul, not as Carl the janitor, but as Richard Ellis, the CEO. And when he did, the entire company would witness the reckoning that was about to unfold. Friday morning began like any other, with employees trickling into the office, their chatter filling the air as the day's routines took hold. But for Richard Ellis, the CEO disguised as Carl the janitor, it was anything but ordinary. He stood in the supply closet, staring at his reflection in the streaked mirror. Today was the day. After weeks of observing, questioning, and testing, he was ready to reveal himself and confront the issues he had uncovered. His heart raced at the thought of the reactions he might face, but his resolve was unshakable. It was time to tear down the facade and expose the truth. Richard started his morning rounds as usual, pushing his mop and bucket through the hallways. He exchanged polite nods with Megan at the reception desk, who smiled warmly despite the early hour. Sarah, as always, was at her desk, her head buried in paperwork. Paul, the senior manager, breezed past without a second glance, barking orders into his phone. Richard clenched his jaw, but he kept his expression neutral. He couldn't afford to tip his hand just yet. The plan was simple. He would call an impromptu all-staff meeting under the pretense of a routine announcement. Once everyone was gathered, he would reveal his identity and address the toxic behaviors he had observed. But before that, he had one final task to complete. As he made his way to the break room, Richard noticed Ethan, the young intern, struggling to carry a stack of binders. Ethan's face was flushed, his steps unsteady under the weight of the load. Without hesitation, Richard stepped forward. "Let me help you with that," he said, taking half the binders. Ethan blinked in surprise. "Thanks, Carl. I appreciate it." Richard nodded, his voice low. "Hang in there. Things are going to get better around here." Ethan gave him a puzzled look but didn't press further. Richard knew that by the end of the day, Ethan, and everyone else, would understand what he meant. By mid-morning, the office was buzzing with whispers about the sudden meeting. Employees speculated about budget changes, new projects, or even layoffs. Paul, ever the self-assured manager, strolled into the conference room with his usual air of superiority, a smirk playing on his lips. "Let's hope this is worth my time," he muttered to no one in particular. Richard entered last, still in his janitor's uniform, and took a position near the back of the room. The murmurs quieted as employees noticed his presence. Paul shot him a disdainful glance, clearly irritated by the perceived intrusion. "What's the janitor doing here?" Paul sneered. "This meeting is for staff." Richard stepped forward, his voice calm but commanding. "I am staff, Paul. In fact, I'm the most important staff member in this room." The silence that followed was deafening. All eyes turned to Richard as he reached up and removed his cap, revealing his familiar face. Gasps echoed through the room, followed by a stunned hush. Megan's mouth fell open. Sarah's pen slipped from her hand, and Ethan looked like he might faint. Paul, for the first time in Richard's memory, was utterly speechless. "I'm Richard Ellis," he said, his voice steady, "founder and CEO of Horizon Dynamics. For the past few weeks, I've been working undercover as a janitor to see how this company really operates when no one thinks the boss is watching." The room erupted in a cacophony of reactions: shock, confusion, and, from a few, nervous laughter. Richard held up a hand, and the noise subsided. "I've learned a lot during my time as Carl," he continued. "I've seen incredible acts of kindness and selflessness. Megan, you've been a beacon of positivity and support in this office. Sarah, your dedication and resilience are nothing short of inspiring. Ethan, you've shown more determination than many people twice your age." Each name he mentioned drew surprised looks and murmurs of approval. Megan's cheeks flushed, and Sarah blinked rapidly, clearly moved. Ethan managed a small, grateful smile. "But I've also seen behavior that has no place in this company, or any company," Richard said, his tone hardening. His gaze locked on Paul, whose face had turned an alarming shade of red. "Paul, your leadership style is toxic, and your actions have caused unnecessary stress and harm to this team. Mocking employees, dismissing their concerns, and planning layoffs for those who are already struggling. That ends today." Paul spluttered, trying to find his voice. "I was just following the company's directives." "It's all about efficiency, isn't it?" Richard's eyes narrowed. "Efficiency doesn't mean trampling over people. It doesn't mean ignoring their humanity. This company was built on innovation and teamwork, not fear and intimidation." The room was deathly silent as Paul shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Richard turned his attention back to the rest of the staff. "Starting today, we're implementing changes to ensure that everyone here feels valued and supported. We'll be revisiting performance metrics to focus on growth and improvement, not punishment. We'll introduce wellness programs to help employees balance work and personal life. And most importantly, we'll be creating a culture where kindness and respect are the norm, not the exception." The employees erupted into applause, their faces lighting up with hope and relief. Richard could see the weight lifting from Sarah's shoulders, the spark of excitement returning to Megan's eyes, and the newfound confidence in Ethan's posture. As the applause died down, Richard took a deep breath. "But I can't do this alone. Change requires all of us to step up. If you see something that's not right, speak up. If you can help someone, do it. Together, we can make Horizon Dynamics a place we're all proud to work." The meeting ended with a standing ovation. As the employees filed out, many stopped to shake Richard's hand, their gratitude evident in their smiles and words. Megan hugged him, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "I never thought anyone would care enough to do this." Paul, meanwhile, slunk out of the room, his usual bravado replaced by a nervous shuffle. Richard had decided to give him one final chance to redeem himself, but he made it clear that any further missteps would result in immediate termination. That evening, as Richard walked through the now empty office, he felt a sense of accomplishment he hadn't experienced in years. For the first time, he wasn't just running a company, he was leading it. And while there was still work to be done, he knew they were on the right path. Looking out at the city lights, Richard thought about the lessons he had learned over the past few weeks. Kindness and empathy weren't just nice-to-haves. They were essential. They had the power to transform not just a workplace, but the lives of everyone in it. As he turned off the lights and prepared to leave, a thought struck him. He picked up a marker and wrote on the whiteboard in the conference room. What would you do if you thought no one was watching? It was a question he hoped his employees and viewers would ponder long after the story was told. The days following the revelation were transformative for Horizon Dynamics. Richard's bold move sent shockwaves through the company, and the effects rippled far beyond the walls of the office. Employees were still buzzing about the meeting, and many found themselves reassessing their roles, behaviors, and attitudes. For Richard, the work was just beginning. The reckoning with Paul, The creation of new policies and the delicate task of rebuilding trust among his employees required careful attention. Richard's first order of business was to deal with Paul. Despite Paul's toxic leadership, Richard believed in second chances, but only if they were earned. He called Paul into his office for a one-on-one meeting, this time as Richard Ellis, the CEO, not Carl the janitor. Paul entered the room hesitantly, his usual confidence replaced with visible apprehension. "Have a seat," Richard said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Paul obeyed, fidgeting with his tie as he sat down. "You know why we're here," Richard began, his voice steady but firm. "Your behavior over the past few weeks, and likely long before, has not only harmed your team, but also jeopardized the values this company was built on." Paul opened his mouth to defend himself, but Richard held up a hand to silence him. "I'm not interested in excuses. What I need to know is whether you're willing to change. This is your chance to prove that you can lead with integrity and respect. If you can't do that, you have no future here." Paul swallowed hard, his face pale. I understand, Mr. Ellis. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." Richard leaned back in his chair, studying him. "Actions speak louder than words, Paul. I'll be watching, and so will your team. If I see even a hint of the behavior you've displayed in the past, you're gone. No warnings, no discussions, just gone. Do I make myself clear?" Paul nodded fervently. "Crystal clear, sir." With that, the meeting ended. Richard wasn't sure if Paul would rise to the occasion or falter, but he was prepared to act swiftly if necessary. For now, he turned his attention to the broader changes needed within the company. Richard's next move was to assemble a task force to address workplace culture and employee well-being. He handpicked a diverse group of employees, including Megan, Sarah, and Ethan, to ensure that every level of the company had a voice. Their first meeting was filled with passionate discussions and creative ideas, ranging from mentorship programs to mental health initiatives. Megan proposed a kindness fund to assist employees facing unexpected hardships, while Sarah suggested flexible work hours for parents and caregivers. Ethan, shy at first, eventually spoke up about the need for better training and support for interns and junior staff. Richard listened intently, taking notes and encouraging open dialogue. He felt a surge of pride as he watched his employees collaborate, their shared determination to create a better workplace evident in every word and gesture. By the end of the meeting, they had a clear plan of action. New policies that prioritized empathy, inclusivity, and personal growth. As the weeks went by, the changes began to take shape. A new mentorship program paired senior employees with juniors to foster collaboration and knowledge sharing. An anonymous feedback system allowed employees to voice concerns without fear of retaliation. The Kindness Fund became a reality, funded initially by Richard himself, but later supported by voluntary contributions from employees. Wellness programs, including yoga sessions, meditation classes, and financial planning workshops, were introduced, and flexible schedules became standard for those who needed them. The transformation wasn't without its challenges. Some employees resisted the changes, viewing them as unnecessary or overly idealistic. But as time passed, even the skeptics began to see the benefits. Productivity increased, absenteeism decreased, and the overall atmosphere in the office improved dramatically. Employees who once dreaded coming to work now found themselves looking forward to the day ahead. Richard continued to walk the halls regularly, this time as himself, but with the same humility he had embraced as Carl. He made it a point to greet employees by name, ask about their lives, and genuinely listen to their concerns. His presence wasn't intimidating, it was reassuring. Employees began to see him not just as a CEO, but as a leader who truly cared about their well-being. Megan thrived in her new role as the head of the company's Employee Engagement Committee. Her infectious positivity and genuine compassion made her a natural fit for the position. Sarah, freed from the constant fear of losing her job, excelled in her work and even took on a mentorship role, helping other working parents navigate the challenges of balancing career and family. Ethan, bolstered by the support and training he received, blossomed into a confident and capable team member. Even Paul showed signs of change. He attended leadership workshops and sought feedback from his team, making a concerted effort to improve. While some remained wary of his intentions, others began to see glimpses of genuine growth. Richard kept a close eye on him, ready to intervene if necessary, but for now, he allowed Paul the opportunity to prove himself. The impact of these changes extended beyond the company. Horizon Dynamics transformation became a topic of conversation in the business community, inspiring other organizations to reevaluate their own practices. Richard was invited to speak at conferences, where he shared the lessons he had learned from his Undercover experiment. He emphasized the importance of empathy, transparency, and the willingness to listen, even, or especially, to the voices that often went unheard. Months later, as Richard walked through the office on a bright Monday morning, he paused to observe his employees. The once tense atmosphere had been replaced by one of collaboration and camaraderie. Laughter echoed from the break room, and the conference rooms buzzed with productive energy. Richard felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The journey had been difficult, but it had been worth every step. As he stood there, Megan approached him with a shy smile. "We wanted to thank you," she said, handing him a card signed by the entire staff, "for everything you've done. This place wouldn't be the same without you." Richard opened the card, his heart swelling as he read the heartfelt messages from his employees. One note stood out. "Thank you for reminding us that kindness isn't a weakness. It's our greatest strength." That evening, as Richard reflected on the journey, he realized how much he had changed too. The experience had taught him that true leadership wasn't about power or authority. It was about connection, understanding, and the courage to do what was right. As he turned off the lights in his office, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Horizon Dynamics had become more than just a company. It was a family. And that was a legacy he was proud to build. Months after the transformation of Horizon Dynamics began, the changes had not only solidified within the company, but had also started to ripple outward into the larger community. The company's newfound focus on empathy, collaboration, and well-being had garnered attention from local media outlets, sparking curiosity and admiration. But for Richard Ellis, the journey was far from over. If anything, the success of the initial changes fueled his desire to delve even deeper, to uncover the untapped potential within his employees and his own leadership. One crisp autumn morning, Richard sat in his office, gazing out at the skyline. The city looked serene, but his mind was alive with ideas. A knock at the door broke his train of thought, and Megan entered with her usual bright smile. "We've got a visitor in the lobby," she said. "He says he's from the local high school. Wants to talk about a partnership." Intrigued, Richard stood and followed her to the reception area, where a young teacher named Mr. Howard waited. He explained that his school was struggling to fund its vocational programs and wanted to collaborate with Horizon Dynamics to provide mentorship and hands-on experience for students. Richard's mind immediately flashed back to Ethan, the once struggling intern who had blossomed under the company's new culture. The idea of extending that kind of support to young minds was irresistible. Within weeks, Horizon Dynamics had launched a pilot program with the school. Employees volunteered to mentor students, offering insights into technology, finance, and workplace dynamics. Sarah, who had become a natural leader in her department, spearheaded the project, working tirelessly to ensure its success. Ethan, now confident and flourishing in his role, volunteered to guide students through their internships, sharing his own story to inspire them. The program quickly became a cornerstone of Horizon Dynamics community outreach. Students who had once doubted their abilities found themselves excelling under the guidance of compassionate mentors. One young girl, Maria, stood out. Shy and unsure of herself at first, she blossomed after working with Sarah, who encouraged her to embrace her strengths and take risks. By the end of her internship, Maria had designed an innovative process that improved efficiency in one of the company's departments, earning her a scholarship funded by the new Horizon Futures initiative. As the mentorship program flourished, so did the relationships within Horizon Dynamics. Employees who had once seen each other as competitors began working together more cohesively, inspired by the positive energy the students brought into the workplace. Richard noticed how even Paul, whose leadership style had undergone a dramatic shift, was actively participating, guiding students with patience and genuine interest. It was as if the presence of young, eager minds had reignited a sense of purpose and creativity across the board. Meanwhile, Richard continued to reflect on the lessons he had learned during his time undercover. He decided to document his experience in a series of internal memos titled Reflections from the Janitor's Closet. The memos were candid and introspective, sharing not only the challenges he had faced, but also the moments that had moved him deeply. In one memo, he wrote, "Leadership is not about issuing orders from the top. It's about understanding the struggles of those at the bottom. True change comes when we have the courage to listen, to empathize, and to act with integrity, even when it's uncomfortable." The memos became a source of inspiration for employees, sparking conversations about leadership, ethics, and the kind of company they wanted to build together. Megan, who had grown into her role as the head of employee engagement, organized a series of workshops based on the memos, inviting employees to share their own stories and ideas. The sessions were transformative, deepening the sense of community within the company. One evening, as Richard walked through the office after hours, he paused at the break room, where Megan and Sarah were wrapping up a workshop. The walls were covered with colorful sticky notes, each bearing a message from an employee. Some were suggestions for improvement, while others were simple affirmations. "I feel valued here. We're stronger together. This place changed my life." Richard felt a lump rise in his throat. For years, he had measured success in profits and market share. Now, he realized, the true measure of success was written on those sticky notes. It was in the faces of his employees, the laughter in the break room, and the hope he saw in the students who walked through Horizon Dynamics doors. But the most unexpected moment came during the company's annual holiday party. As employees gathered to celebrate the year's accomplishments, Megan stepped onto the stage, holding a small box. "Before we wrap up," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "we have a surprise for Mr. Ellis." Richard, caught off guard, stepped forward as Megan handed him the box. Inside was a framed photo of the entire staff, signed by every employee. Beneath the photo were the words, "Thank you for seeing us. Thank you for leading with heart." The room erupted into applause as Richard stood there, overwhelmed. He looked out at his team, the people who had become more than employees. They were his partners, his friends, his family. In that moment, he knew he had achieved something far greater than building a successful company. He had created a legacy. As the night wore on, Richard found himself standing by the window, watching the snow fall outside. Megan joined him, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "So," she said, nudging him playfully, "what's next for Horizon Dynamics?" Richard smiled, his mind already racing with possibilities. "We keep building," he said, "not just the company, but the community, the future, together." And as the snow blanketed the city in a quiet promise of renewal, Richard felt a profound sense of gratitude. The journey that had begun with a mop and a disguise had transformed not only his company, but also his life. It was a reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could spark the greatest changes, and that the true measure of success was not what you built, but how you inspired others to build alongside you. With that thought, he turned back to the celebration, ready to embrace whatever came next. After all, this was only the beginning.